Before the United States became a nation built on ideals of freedom and equality, it was built on something far more uncomfortable. Before democracy took root, bondage shaped the land, the economy, and the very meaning of power. And long before the words "all men are created equal" were written, millions lived in chains, shaping a nation that would struggle for centuries to reconcile its contradictions. Slavery was not a side story in early American history, it was a foundation. From the first European settlements to the birth of the Republic, slavery influenced politics, economics, culture, and identity in ways that still echo today. To understand America, one must first understand how deeply slavery shaped its beginnings. The story begins long before independence, in the early 1600s, when European powers raced to colonize the New World. The English colonies that would later become the United States were driven by profit, land, and labor. At first, indentured servants, mostly poor Europeans, provided much of that labor. But as plantation economies expanded, especially in the southern colonies, the demand for a permanent, controllable workforce grew. In 1619, a ship carrying enslaved Africans arrived in Virginia. This moment would mark the beginning of a system that transformed the continent. Over time, racial slavery became institutionalized, legally codified, and inherited across generations. What began as economic convenience hardened into a rigid racial hierarchy. Slavery fueled the economic growth of the colonies. Tobacco, rice, indigo, and later cotton became immensely profitable, and enslaved labor made that wealth possible. Ports thrived, merchants prospered, and global trade networks expanded, all tied to human bondage. Northern colonies, often viewed as morally distant from slavery, were deeply connected through shipping, finance, insurance, and manufacturing. Slavery was not just a Southern institution, it was a national one. As the colonies grew, so did the contradictions. Enlightenment ideals of liberty, natural rights, and self-governance spread across the Atlantic. Thinkers spoke of freedom and equality while millions were denied both. This contradiction haunted early American leaders. Many recognized the injustice of slavery but failed, or refused, to dismantle it. Economic dependence, racial prejudice, and political compromise preserved the institution. When the American Revolution erupted, enslaved people recognized the language of liberty as an opportunity. Thousands sought freedom by escaping, rebelling, or aligning with whichever side promised emancipation. Both the British and the Patriots exploited these desires, revealing how deeply slavery was intertwined with war and power. The Revolution created a new nation, but it did not resolve slavery. Instead, it embedded the contradiction into the nation's foundation. The Constitution protected slavery through compromises, the Three-Fifths Compromise, the Fugitive Slave Clause, and the delay of the international slave trade ban. These decisions were not accidents, they were deliberate choices meant to preserve unity at the expense of justice. As the United States expanded westward, slavery followed. Each new territory reopened old debates: would it enter the Union free or enslaved? These arguments were not merely political, they defined whose labor, whose bodies, and whose futures would shape the nation. Compromises postponed conflict, but they could not erase it. Slavery also shaped American culture and identity. It influenced language, religion, law, and social hierarchy. Enslaved people built communities, preserved traditions, and resisted oppression through faith, family, and culture. Their resilience created enduring cultural legacies that would shape American music, food, storytelling, and resistance movements. Meanwhile, enslavers crafted ideologies to justify the system. Pseudoscientific racism, religious interpretations, and legal frameworks emerged to defend slavery as natural or beneficial. These ideas hardened racial divisions and normalized inequality, leaving deep scars that extended far beyond emancipation. By the early 19th century, tensions reached a breaking point. Abolitionist movements gained strength, challenging slavery on moral and political grounds. Enslaved people resisted through rebellion, escape, and everyday acts of defiance. The nation stood divided between those who saw slavery as essential and those who saw it as a moral catastrophe. The Civil War would ultimately erupt from these unresolved contradictions. Slavery was not a side issue, it was the central cause. When the war ended and slavery was abolished, the transformation of American society had only begun. Freedom did not mean equality, and emancipation did not erase centuries of exploitation. Reconstruction offered a brief moment of possibility. Laws were passed, rights were promised, and formerly enslaved people sought education, land, and political participation. But resistance was fierce. Violence, discrimination, and legal barriers soon undermined progress, allowing old hierarchies to reassert themselves in new forms. Yet the legacy of slavery did not end in failure alone. It also gave rise to movements for justice, equality, and civil rights that would reshape the nation in the centuries to come. The struggle to fulfill America's ideals became a defining feature of its identity. Understanding how slavery shaped early America means confronting uncomfortable truths. It means recognizing that freedom and oppression were built side by side, and that prosperity often came at a human cost. It means acknowledging that the past is not distant, it lives on in institutions, inequalities, and cultural memory. The story of slavery is not separate from the American story. It is central to it. From the nation's economic foundations to its political struggles, from its cultural expressions to its ongoing debates over justice and equality, slavery's influence is woven into the fabric of the United States. To understand America fully, one must confront this history honestly, not to assign blame, but to gain clarity. Only by understanding how slavery shaped the nation can we understand how the nation continues to shape itself. This is the hidden history of early America, a story of contradiction and courage, cruelty and resilience, oppression and resistance. It is a story that challenges us to look deeper, think harder, and remember that the past is never truly past. As the nation moved forward after emancipation, the legacy of slavery continued to shape every aspect of American life. Freedom, though legally granted, did not come with equality or security. Formerly enslaved people faced systemic barriers designed to limit their political power, economic mobility, and social standing. Sharecropping replaced slavery in practice, trapping families in cycles of debt. Laws known as Black Codes and later Jim Crow enforced segregation and racial hierarchy, ensuring that the power structures born during slavery endured long after its formal end. Yet within this oppression, resilience flourished. African American communities built schools, churches, and mutual aid societies. Education became a powerful form of resistance, and culture became a source of survival. Music, oral traditions, and spirituals carried memories of suffering and hope, shaping the cultural foundation of the nation itself. These contributions would later influence nearly every aspect of American life, from literature and politics to music and civil rights activism. The legacy of slavery also reshaped the nation's political landscape. Debates over citizenship, voting rights, and federal authority continued long after Reconstruction ended. Court decisions and legislation repeatedly rolled back protections, revealing how deeply slavery's influence was embedded in law and governance. Each generation inherited the unresolved tensions of the past, often repackaged in new forms. Economically, the wealth extracted through enslaved labor helped finance American expansion and industrial growth. Banks, railroads, universities, and corporations benefited directly or indirectly from systems built on exploitation. These foundations created long-lasting inequalities that persist in wealth gaps and access to opportunity today. At the same time, the fight against these injustices produced some of the most powerful movements in American history. From abolitionists to civil rights leaders, individuals and communities continued to challenge the nation to live up to its ideals. Their efforts reshaped laws, transformed public consciousness, and expanded the meaning of freedom for all Americans. Understanding how slavery shaped early America is not about assigning guilt, it is about recognizing cause and consequence. It is about understanding how deeply history influences the present, and how the structures created centuries ago still shape opportunity, power, and identity today. The story of slavery is not confined to the past. It lives in debates over equality, justice, and national memory. It shapes conversations about education, opportunity, and representation. It reminds us that progress is not automatic, it requires awareness, honesty, and sustained effort. To confront this history is not to diminish the American story, but to complete it. It allows for a fuller understanding of how resilience emerged from oppression and how the pursuit of freedom has always required courage, sacrifice, and collective responsibility. The story of early America is inseparable from the story of slavery. It is a history of contradiction and complexity, of injustice and resistance, of suffering and strength. And by understanding it fully, we gain the ability not only to remember the past, but to shape a more just future. That is the deeper truth behind how slavery shaped early America, a truth that continues to echo through the nation's laws, culture, and conscience today. In the end, the story of how slavery shaped early America is not just a chapter in a history book, it is the foundation upon which the nation was built. It explains the contradictions between liberty and oppression, prosperity and exploitation, unity and division. It reveals how freedom was proclaimed while denied, how progress was pursued alongside injustice, and how the struggle for equality became woven into the nation's identity. America's early growth, its institutions, and even its ideals were forged in this tension. Slavery shaped its economy, influenced its politics, and defined its social order. Yet from within that system also emerged resistance, resilience, and a relentless push toward change. The same nation that sanctioned bondage also produced voices that challenged it, movements that confronted it, and generations that refused to accept it as permanent. Understanding this history does not weaken the American story, it deepens it. It allows us to see the nation not as a finished product, but as an ongoing experiment shaped by struggle, contradiction, and moral reckoning. The past cannot be undone, but it can be understood, and through understanding comes responsibility. The legacy of slavery continues to shape conversations about justice, equality, and opportunity today. Its echoes remain in institutions, communities, and collective memory. Acknowledging this legacy is not about dwelling on guilt, it is about recognizing truth and using it to build a more honest and inclusive future. The story of early America, shaped so profoundly by slavery, reminds us that history is not distant or abstract. It lives in the present, influencing who we are and who we become. And only by confronting it fully can a nation move forward with clarity, integrity, and purpose.